In the history of the Monster Hunter games, there has been a surprisingly large focus on guns. You have the light bow gun, you have the heavy bow gun. There's even a medium bow gun in one game. You have a hammer that looks like part of a gun, and even have dual blades that look like 2 guns. But in Monster Hunter DOS, early on, this was taken a step further. What if the design of a weapon wasn't just visual? What if a melee-based weapon was taken and turned into a gun? Have you heard about the lance? Well, let me introduce you to its more ballistic sibling, the Gunlance, taking the defensive state and potential from the lance and combining it with the explosive damage of heavy artillery, or maybe more accurately, a sawed-off shotgun. You're not going to be sniping enemies from long distances with this bad boy, but you will definitely be kicking down doors and point-blank firing away to wipe monsters out of existence. It's a seriously ridiculous concept, but one with a lot of merit. Hell, you can even fly across maps and rise thanks to one of the weapon's latest abilities. It's a crazy and stylish weapon, and one that's been requested constantly in the comments of the weapon videos, so I'm happy to finally be talking about it today. As I mentioned in previous videos, I like to take your opinions into consideration when it comes to which weapon I will cover next. If you want your weapon to be covered soon, be sure to let me know in the comments, and please consider liking and subscribing so the all-seeing eye of the YouTube algorithm will bless me and return my family. I'm currently traveling down the 7 levels of hell to try and find them with some weird Roman poet as my guide, and he's really pretentious, and I'm starting to lose my sanity. Anyway, I'm super rad, and this is the history of the Gunlance. You knew this section of the vid was sponsored by NordVPN, right? NordVPN is great for me as someone who plays online games. See, my internet service provider does this thing where if you're using too much internet, they throttle you. NordVPN can help secure my browser traffic with no effect to my latency whatsoever, meaning that when I'm playing games online, or more importantly streaming for you all, I'm not going to be experiencing forced hiccups like lag or dropped frames. And if I'm destroying someone online in a competitive fighter, as I do, I can feel safe knowing that they won't be able to retaliate in any nefarious ways because NordVPN will help me avoid things like DDoS attacks. Oh, and if a game I want to play is region locked or banned in my country for some weird reason, I can simply change my location easily through the app and make anything available in the region available to me. Even things like region-specific discounts are available to me, meaning I'm saving more money on all of my favorite games. If this sounds like something you're interested in, go to nordvpn.com/superrad to find out more information or use coupon superrad to get a 2-year plan plus 1 additional month with a huge discount. It helps support me and helps secure you. Gunlance was introduced in Monster Hunter DOS on the PS2, a game released in Japan only but would appear again in Monster Hunter Freedom 2 and Freedom Unite, and while skipping Try would appear in each subsequent release after it. For the sake of the video, when talking about Generation 2 Gunlance, I'll be using footage from Freedom Unite, so keep that in mind with anything that I'm discussing here. Gunlance is interesting for a multitude of reasons, but one of the more unlikely aspects of it is that it focuses more on cutting or slashing damage instead of piercing damage that the lance would see until Monster Hunter Freedom Unite. That means on top of the artillery or shelling moves that we'll get into shortly, this weapon was great for hitting weak zones susceptible to cutting attacks or even cutting tails. Hunters could attack in succession up to 3 times with this weapon, either with 3 forward pokes or, if guarding, 3 upward pokes. This was accomplished by pressing up or down on the right analog stick in DOS or the triangle button in the PSP releases. The upswing is especially useful for reaching the head or tails of monsters that keep them raised while remaining in a defensive state, and was considered the bread and butter of the weapon all the way up to a world where the animation was made significantly slower. There's also a draw attack for the weapon that can be performed while unsheathed by holding forward while pressing triangle, and an upward swinging move by pressing triangle and circle at the same time. There's also a quick guard mechanic where hunters can guard immediately out of a draw by pressing R and triangle at the same time. The weapon improves on the dodging mechanic by allowing hunters to sidestep after an attack by pressing the X button while holding either side direction. Alternatively, they can even backstep by pressing the X button while unsheathed and not moving. This can be used in conjunction with the reloading mechanic of the Gunlance's shelling mechanic for efficient play. The weapon has a set of ammo which is displayed under the health and stamina bars. By pressing circle, players can fire off close range explosions for high fixed damage with portions of fire damage for a limited period of time. Once out of ammo, the hunter needs to reload by pressing circle while guarding, but by side or backstepping and pressing circle following this animation, the hunter can reload much quicker while also repositioning. You'll generally be using using these shelling attacks in conjunction with the base attacks of the Gunlance, and they come in a variety of styles, specifically normal, wide, and long. Long, as you may assume, has longer range, while wide shots cover a wider but shorter range. Both of these shell types are stronger than using normal, and to make up for this, normal shots offer 5 shells per reload in comparison to the 3 per reload for long and the 2 per reload for wide. Using the load up skill would boost each of these values by 1, but seems generally underutilized in early games. Each Gunlance will come with a specific shell type and they aren't interchangeable. They also come with shell levels from 1 to 5, with the maximum level changing between different games in each generation. For example, in Freedom Unite, some lances have a shell level of 5. Hunters will see higher damage at higher levels. However, spamming this ability may seem advantageous, but comes with a large downside. And that's the fact that it will eat through your sharpness gauge like it's a 2-bite brownie. Specifically, it will eat 2 points of sharpness with the normal and long types and 4 with wide. Though wide was changed to 2 as well in the Devil Joe patch for Monster Hunter World, making it highly useful in Generation 5. Overuse of the shelling mechanic will ruin the sharpness of your weapon and lead to a lot of downtime with whetstones and getting tossed around by whatever you're fighting. It's more useful to attack up to 3 times with the generic stabbing mechanic and then fire off a shell, which will reset the combo and allow you to keep attacking. While not infinite, it can lead to very long combos, ones that will almost definitely be cut short because you would end naturally due to the movements and attacks of the monsters that you're hunting. It should be pointed out that the shelling comes with a small super armor effect to prevent flinching from weak attacks, and while hunters could spam the shelling attack in Freedom Unite, future entries would see more of a recoil effect, making this impossible. In Monster Hunter DOS and Freedom 2, this mechanic of shelling even had iframes, but whether or not that was intentional, I'm not sure. I should also point out that while in red sharpness, the hunter couldn't shell at all, and would see penalties to damage based on how low their sharpness color was. Yellow and orange saw a times 0.85 damage multiplier, and anything from green onward was the normal damage value. But that's not the only way to completely obliterate the sharpness of your weapon. On top of having the ability to fire off shells, Gunlance can obliterate monsters with a special cooldown mechanic known as Wyvern Fire, and is potentially the key aspect of the weapon that makes it so cool and appealing to the players that main it. By pressing the triangle and circle button together while holding guard, the player will begin to build up a large amount of energy at the tip of the Gunlance barrel before firing it off in a short range, large explosion that both deals almost quadruple the normal amount of damage and also sends the hunter sliding backwards from the recoil. Hunters can even aim this attack within a 180-degree angle. It's ridiculous and seriously looks so cool and fun that I found myself wanting to solely use this mechanic when possible, but it's not possible to spam it for a multitude of reasons. For one, it has a cooldown effect, something like 2 minutes or lower before the hunter is allowed to use the mechanic again. Adding to that, it absolutely rips through your sharpness gauge and leaves you susceptible to incoming attacks due to the long recoil animation. While there's no timer to let you know when the Wyvern's Fire is available again, there's a visual change on the barrel of the various Gunlances to indicate this, and a sound effect will play once the cooldown period is over. It also has a huge stagger modifier, so could often be used to force flinch monsters and interrupt them. Guarding with the Gunlance is one of the strongest defensive options in the game, along with the lance, and will allow you to safely block most attacks, many of which can't be blocked by other weapons like the sword and shield. This allows the weapon to follow a very slow-moving but methodical state of play, where you utilize things like sidesteps and backsteps to stay as mobile as possible while getting damage where you can, and that damage will count for a lot in the end. Utilizing mobility options and extending combos with shelling made this weapon much more versatile than it may have seemed. But even though those options were available, most hunters would be better off performing shorter combos like the poke upswing or upswing into poke into another upswing. Let's move on to Portable Third and Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate to see what Generation 3 added to the equation. As I mentioned previously, the Gunlance, along with many other weapons, didn't actually make it into Monster Hunter Tri, a decision that we wouldn't see happen again in any future release. And all of the changes we see in Portable Third are carried over into 3 Ultimate. For that reason, I'll be using footage specifically from the Wii U release, but everything I talk about is representative of the weapon in Generation 3 as a whole. One of the more noticeable changes is how the traditional 3-stab combo has been changed, I guess. Now, instead of a final 3rd stab during the combo, the hunter will instead perform perform an overhead slam attack that requires additional buildup and animation time, but there's a lot that can be done with this move. Before that, we need to talk about an additional new mechanic, the quick reload. If you remember from the previous generation, the hunter would run out of ammo after a certain amount of shell usage, forcing them to reload on the spot or reload after a sidestep or backstep maneuver. This is still possible, but with the added opportunity of quick reloading. After firing off a shell shot, hunters can now automatically reload their shells with a quicker animation and even immediately fire off another shot following this, meaning it's possible to fire, quick reload, fire again, and quick reload again indefinitely as long as the hunter has the opportunity to do so. But the hunter doesn't have to fire a second shot after the reload. In fact, it's actually a second way to enter into the overhead slam attack, and there were actually many ways to get into the upswing, which would allow you to follow up with the new slam. So there's many ways of going about this, either through the traditional triple combo or weaving it out of a quick reload or many other opportunities. But what's so good about the overhead slam? The main advantage is that it leads into a brand new attack called full burst, where the hunter can perform said overhead slam and then follow up with an explosive attack that will expend all of their remaining ammo, dealing damage based on how much was used. Further, the hunter can combo into the Wyvern's Fire attack out of this slam instead of a full burst if they have it available. Charged shelling is another new mechanic that helps weave shelling into normal combos. As I mentioned previously, hunters could throw a shell into their combo to extend it. Now hunters can press R and circle after any attack to actually charge the attack before firing it off for extra damage, and this combo can be performed after a multitude of attacks that change its behavior slightly, basically allowing the hunter to either charge forward, slightly upward, or almost vertically. These attacks have about a 20% increase in damage, but can be affected by shell type, as we will see in a second. Oh, and you can even combo charge shots into charge shots if you want to, and can unload some quick damage within an opening. And you can cancel advancing thrust or unsheath attack into a shell or charged shell starting in this generation. Shelling causes the player to lose less sharpness than the previous generation, making it a more viable option than ever before. In fact, something that I didn't mention yet is that shelling ignores hit zone values and has fixed damage, meaning no matter where it hits, it's going to have the same effect. Each one of the shell types is a bit more unique than before. Due to the normal shells having a higher number of total shells available before a reload, this type is actually more effective for full burst. It even gets a modifier when using said ability. Meanwhile, the long shell type actually has a stronger Wyvern's Fire in comparison to the other two options, and wide shell types get a 45% damage boost with charged shells rather than a 20% boost on top of a stagger boost. Fun fact, there was actually a glitch in Portable Third that required an auto guard talisman reward that you received for completing the village quests. By equipping the talisman, the hunter will begin to automatically guard during a quick reload as if it was a guard point, and this would only be possible with the talisman specifically. Having auto guard through other means would not allow this to happen. It's hilarious because this would be added to the Gunlance purposefully in later generations. Overall, Generation 3 looked to up the viability and damage output of the Gunlance in comparison to its Generation 2 predecessor, but overall fell kind of flat. Unfortunately for the weapon, the design and damage output forced hunters to rely more on melee Gunlance outside of very specific matchups. But with all that out of the way, we can now move on to Generation 4 to see what Monster Hunter 4 and Generations brought to the table. There's not too much to talk about with 4 and 4 Ultimate specifically, but it did introduce a few new mechanics for the weapon, including an entirely new move and ways to create finisher opportunities through jumping attacks. As with all weapons in Monster Hunter 4 and 4 Ultimate, Gunlance now has the ability to perform aerial attacks that lead to mounting damage. The Gunlance specifically gets the ability to perform its overhead slam attack that was introduced in Generation 3, and upon doing so, follow up with a full burst or Wyvern's Fire attack. Wyvern's Fire's cooldown mechanic is also more noticeable now as the weapon begins to smoke during the cooldown period. There's even a new move that hunters can perform where they dash forward before firing off a shell by guarding and pressing the shelling button. This move can be implemented into a jumping attack by performing the dash off of a ledge, leading to the shell being activated mid-air, which can be then followed up by an aerial overhead slam, allowing for the hunter to then perform a finisher. Overall, there isn't much here. The ability to use aerial attacks really didn't do much for the Gunlance, and Monster Hunter 4 was another game where melee Gunlance remained the king of the weapons options. There was also the introduction of the the Artillery God skill, which was a third tier for the artillery series and was a good start on moving the weapon forward in terms of shelling strategies. One final thing to note for Monster Hunter 4 is that every entry before Generation 4 had the hunters start with empty shells and required them to reload. Monster Hunter 4 changed this to have all shells loaded at the beginning of a hunt. It makes sense since there's no reason for the hunter to start without having their ammo loaded. Now, Generations brings with it an obviously large amount of changes with the inclusion of hunter arts and styles, but that's not all. The biggest change in mechanics was the introduction of the heat gauge, arguably one of the more unpopular changes to a weapon. Imagine if you took all of the destructive power, and by destructive power I mean slightly more than hunting horn, of the Gunlance in 4U and locked it behind an arbitrary mechanic that required you to watch over and maintain it regularly just to do the damage that you were given for free in previous entries within the series. Ass. That is the heat gauge. By shelling regularly, you build up a gauge value from yellow to orange and finally to red. When in red, your damage would be at its highest, but by raising the gauge too high, you'd find yourself overheating and be locked to yellow for around 2 minutes, which is highly detrimental to efficient play. This meant hunters had to work up to red gauge and keep it balanced by using a combination of shelling to raise the gauge and lance attacks and dodging to reduce it. Mechanics like Wyvern's Fire were useful as they would lower the heat gauge but then lock it in place for a short period of time, meaning the hunter would have more free reign over what abilities to use while hunting a monster. Shell types would also directly affect the size of the gauge, meaning different shell types would require different amounts of attacks for reaching the next level. To help with this, people would often slot in Artillery Novice as it gave a 10% damage boost to shelling and also affected how the gauge was raised and depleted. A move like Wyvern's Fire would decrease the gauge less if the hunter was running Artillery Novice, meaning that there were more opportunities to use it and lock it into red gauge. On a more positive note, the Gunlance gained the ability to backstep or sidestep at a full burst, meaning hunters could cancel out of the recoil animation to quickly get back into the fight and stay out of danger. Out of all the hunter styles, Adept and Valor were probably the most used for efficient play. Adept style was particularly useful. Hunters that used this would sacrifice the ability to quick load but gain the ability to Adept guard. Most weapons in the game will allow you to Adept evade, but weapons with large shields like the Gunlance are a little different. Instead, guarding at the right time functions as a guard point and allows the hunter the opportunity to counterattack with an upward thrust that reloads the weapon, making it highly useful for damage and resource management. The first attack in this counter would do additional damage if the hunter had full shells. This guard point is great for abusing full burst as well, but was more useful for the built-in counterattacks as the motion values were so absurdly high on them. By hitting the guard point and getting the counterattack, the hunter will now have full ammo. Pressing X follows up the counterattack with an overhead slam maneuver, meaning that each guard point can lead into a max ammo full burst, and this is highly abusable for great DPS. There's a large recovery animation on the burst, so again, simply counterattacking was usually best. Valor style is also highly utilized due to the fact that the quick reload now has a guard point similar to what was seen in Adept style. Gunlance benefited a lot from Valor Sheath because it was a quick way to put away the weapon while also having a defensive option in a weapon that lacks both. Wyvern's Fire and the ability to fully reload are activated through the Valor Sheath cancel mechanic, but the quick reload seems to now be possible at any point by pressing R+A, meaning that you have the ability to quickly replenish resources while also potentially countering an attack. Pressing X out of Valor Sheath will perform an upswing and also perform a quick reload, but there's no guard point with this mechanic. When the Valor gauge isn't full, the reload will only offer 1 shell, but when full, it offers 4 for normal, 3 for long, and 2 for wide. Additionally, the hunter can press A during Valor Sheath to perform a quick shell attack. Once in Valor mode, you unlock the ability to perform an infinite with the normal X combo, meaning players can poke twice, perform an overhead slam, and then begin poking again over and over and over and over and over and over and over. On top of that, the quick reload isn't just for a single shell, but will replenish a number of shells depending on which type you are using. Hunters can spam shelling attacks one after the other by pressing the A button, and each successive attack will be stronger and faster than the last, meaning it's a great way to output a ton of damage in a short period of time. This is called rapid shelling and can only be started after an initial attack or from a stationary shell. Small note, but the Striker style actually brought back the triple poke combo from Generation 2, and World would later reintroduce this as well. Moving on to Hunter Arts, some of the more popular options included Dragon's Breath, Anti-Air Flare, and Blast Dash. Dragon's Breath specifically is great for keeping the heat gauge high without having to worry about it as a mechanic. It also boosts the damage to shells themselves, meaning for 1 to 3 minutes you'll be a complete powerhouse, and it ignores if you overheat, locking you into the max red gauge value. Blast Dash was a great gap closer that propelled the hunter forward and could be followed up with an overhead slam. It was so popular that it ended up being reworked into Monster Hunter Rise, so we'll go over it more within that section. New to Generation's ultimate specifically is the anti-air flare, which is an incredibly powerful combo maneuver, generally designed around knocking enemies out of the air, but can be used without caring about that specific tactic. On activation, the hunter will guard point into full reload, into aerial full burst, into wyvern's fire, into a second guard point where you reload once more. This move is useful due to the high damage it outputs, while managing to keep a full set of shells after all is said and done, and this wyvern's fire doesn't actually lower your gauge and will instead lock you wherever your gauge is at currently. It's worth noting that this move cannot overheat you, so it is very, very useful. Overall, the Gunlance in Generations was limited heavily, and most of its abilities seem to attempt to subvert this arbitrary limitation. Due to the insane power creep of this generation of Monster Hunter, Gunlance suffers greatly and just becomes a turtle standing in one spot, adept countering the harder monsters. But with all that said and done, let's finally move on to Generation 5. Monster Hunter World generally either completely reworks a weapon or brings with it a lot of changes, whether they be advantageous or not, and the Gunlance isn't an exception here. For one, quick reload was made much more viable and could be activated after all melee attacks and reloaded all shells instead of some arbitrary amount. One change to mobility is that the Gunlance has the ability to forward hop on top of back and side hopping, and hopping in general is much more fluid and advantageous. Hunters can perform up to 2 back hops consecutively and follow back hops with side hops, similarly to how you can side hop after an attack. There's also a brand new melee attack, one that is potentially the most powerful option outside of shelling. After an overhead slam, hunters generally only had the option to full burst or wyvern's fire, but now by performing said slam and pressing triangle afterward, the hunter will perform the wide sweep maneuver, which has great horizontal range and high damage. It can even be performed after a full burst if desired. Moves like the forward dash thrust are still available, and the overhead slam can be followed up out of it for an easy means of leading into your new wide sweep or your traditional finishers. Additionally, the charge shot has been streamlined slightly, only requiring you to hold down the circle button after an attack in order to begin charging it. Now, all of those changes are fairly massive and useful. The Gunlance is more mobile than ever and has the ability to perform high damage infinite combos with the lance when possible. Wide sweep adds a massive motion value and a combo finisher when the weapon lacked both before, and the forward hop addresses the issue Gunlance had in every other game, that being mobility. But what about the big mechanical changes? Well, there's a brand new attack known as the Wormstake Cannon. Shelling has been given a more traditional combo within this entry. Hunters can press the circle button up to 3 times, performing 2 shelling attacks and finishing off with this Wormstake mechanic as a finisher. The attack will connect for decent damage, but more importantly will leave a shell attached to the monster's head to deal damage over time before exploding. This was situationally good at best in base world due to the long animations and long reloading times. This attack can also be used as a finisher out of full burst or out of the new wide sweep attack. The attack would also scale with raw, which is pretty big for damage and an interesting point as the scaling was removed in Rise. This new mechanic has its own icon underneath the sharpness gauge to let you know when it's possible to use it. Basically, it'll turn red once used and can be reloaded along with your normal shells through the full reload animation, meaning quick reloads will not reload the Wormstake. Finally, the hunter can perform a jumping attack while sliding and either follow this up with an aerial thrust maneuver or an aerial full burst that covers a wider area. Aerial attacks can also be completed by performing a dash attack into a runnable surface, similar to the other weapons that have this mechanic. Now, Iceborne really added one major mechanic for the Gunlance, that being the Wormstake Blast attack, which allows the hunter to load field slinger ammo into their weapon by holding L2 and pressing triangle and circle together. This attack was the first time shelling became the best option Gunlance had for damage. Its explosions also had massive stagger modifiers, which benefited all Gunlance styles excluding slap. The point of this mechanic is to offer a target on the monster for shelling. Generally, where the hunter shells the monster doesn't matter, but now the hunter can target wherever they mark the monster for additional explosions on each attack. This means attacks like normal shelling, charged shelling, full burst, and wyvern's fire will all deal additional damage if you hit the marked area. I've been told long shell types at level 6 made the most use of this mechanic, and yeah, you heard that right. While the cap in previous entries was a maximum of 4 in high rank releases and 5 in G rank releases, Iceborne actually brought shell levels all the way up to 6 and 7. Wormstake's blasts even synergized with other Gunlance players, meaning that you could team up to increase damage output to some pretty insane values. Moving on to Rise, the animation for Wormstake is sped up when used after a charged shell. Speaking of charged shells, they now have an additional mechanic by adding an extra charged level. All 3 shell types will have the red charge state, which provides times 1.5 damage to the normal and long shell types, as well as times 1.4 to wide. But wide comes with an additional yellow charge state, which provides times 2 damage, but they are virtually useless just due to how long they take to charge up at this state. There's still multiple ways to perform the ground slam maneuver, and this can still be followed up as you expect with full burst, wide sweep, and wyvern's fire. A bigger inclusion would be the introduction of aerial shelling, which allows the hunters to remain in the air by continuously firing their shells and gaining height with each attack. Moves like the overhead slam or the newer aerial full burst can still be performed out of this mechanic, but it seems like a great way to reach parts of the monster that you may have had a harder time doing so before. Shell types also received a few additional changes. For one, wide shell now has the ability to stun via worm stake, and long shells, worm stake, and wyvern's fire can do additional damage. Normal also gets a full burst bonus. For the 3 Silkbind attacks, they all mostly focus on benefiting your shells or worm stake in some capacity. First is Guard Edge, which acts as a full counter mechanic. By activating the ability before an attack, the hunter can absorb all damage and follow up with a quick worm stake if loaded, a slam, or wyvern's fire. On top of mitigating damage and allowing for a counter attack, it will also sharpen the hunter's weapon slightly and only cost 1 wire bug. Hail Cutter is the second default ability and launches the hunter upward into the air with an initial attack before having them land with a slam that can be followed by a finisher like full burst. The slam is actually stronger than any other physical move the weapon has. The benefit of this ability is that it will not only completely reload your shells, but also reduce the cooldown period of wyvern's fire. The downside is that it costs 2 wire bugs to use, and they actually increased the base cooldown of wyvern's fire just so that this ability could lower it. Nice one, Capcom. Ground Splitter is an unlockable Silkbind attack and is good for advancing on aggressive enemies due to its inherent super armor. Hunters will still take damage and can die, but there's rarely going to be anything hitting you that hard if you've been keeping up with your equipment upgrades. Though it should be noted that the hunter can still succumb to status effects, and things like paralysis or sleep can interrupt the move. This attack can be followed up with a slam, quick stake, shell, or charged shell. Ground Splitter will also add a green outline to your shells and worm stake icons, temporarily increasing the damage output of both, but this effect is both finite, being based on time, and requires the user to keep their weapon out. It's a 20% boost and is used to compensate for the lack of rank modifiers in this game. Normally, your shelling attacks are fixed damage based off of a modifier that's set for whichever rank you are playing in, but that isn't the case in Rise, at least not for Gunlance. For switch skills, the classic charged shell ability can be switched out for a mechanic called Blast Dash that is similar to one of the abilities from Generation's Ultimate. By holding A, the hunter can charge their Gunlance and propel themselves forward, and can do this up to 3 times in succession while changing directions in between. However, if you Blast Dash after an aerial shell, it can only be done twice. It can inflict uncharged shell damage, but will mostly function as a gap closer, and hunters can attack out of it with most aerial options, and the slam out of it has a higher motion value. It also costs a shell per blast to use, so even though it can be used up to 3 times, you'll need at least 3 shells to do so. Considering its mobility, it could also be considered a replacement for the Palamute and allow you to bring 2 Palicos instead. The quick reload mechanic can also be switched out for the new guard reload ability that will allow the hunter to automatically guard while performing a reload out of an attack at the cost of receiving 3 shells per reload regardless of type instead of a full reload. However, to make up for this, the worm stake can also be reloaded in this manner, meaning it's possible to perform a guard reload, follow up into a charged or base shell attack into worm stake, and then guard reload again if one desires. The angle that the lance was at before the guard reload is maintained during the process. Most of the Gunlance's defensive options are pretty bad, and these defensive additions in Rise are a massive help to the weapon. With all that said, I have nothing else to really mention about Generation 5 for the Gunlance. Honestly, overall, shelling never really seemed to be that much of a factor for Gunlance through the early stages of its lifespan. The weapon lacked mobility, it had poor defensive options despite its shield, and overall prioritized the lance aspect of the weapon over the gun aspect, which is pretty sad considering it was supposed to differentiate itself from base lance using this new mechanic. That being said, the weapon began to change more dramatically within Generation 5, and slowly but surely, shelling became more and more useful and expected for the weapon while still allowing multiple styles of play. Players that wanted to focus on melee or slapping with their weapon could do so effectively, and players that wanted to get more out of the gun aspect could do so as well. While Gunlance may not be the most effective out of the 14 options hunters have to choose from, it's definitely on the path to getting there, with many new options and a large amount of versatility added to it. Anyway, that's all I have for you today in regards to the Gunlance. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. Let me know what your favorite weapon is and what weapon you want me to cover next. I'm also streaming regularly on Twitch now, and our Discord is growing rapidly, so if you want to join the community and maybe participate in viewer hunts, feel free to stop by. Hey there, you made it to the end of the video where I say thank you to all of my patrons. This is the patron part of the video. If you're not a patron, you can still watch. because that's kind of the point. You're supposed to see this and be like, oh, that's cool, and then maybe consider, you know, throwing me a little money, throwing me a little dollar bills, or whatever you feel like. Who knows? You should see some credits here. I believe there should be some credits here. I'm watching them right now. I'm seeing them slide by. And I'm going to personally shout out everybody that is the maximum tier currently on Patreon, so get ready for that. We got KNKY King. I think that's Kinky King. Thank you so much. You're a ballin', you're faded, you're drowning. Thank you. I appreciate it. Ryan Marion, thank you so much. Welcome to the G rank tier. I really do appreciate it. I hope you're having a great day. Thank you for the support. Cyberworm, thank you so much for the support. You're, you know, big community member, always vibing, always being super chill. Really appreciate it. Hope you're having a great day. Mogbit, thank you so much. Another great community member, super supportive. Really appreciate them and, you know, everything that they do. I hope you're having a fantastic one, Mogbit. Loose Tall Goose, thank you so much for the G rank tier. I hope you're having a fantastic day. Keep it up, friend. Kathleen Medjuk, thank you so much. I do appreciate it. Thank you for the G rank tier. I hope you're having a great day. Hope, you know, the dog is doing great. You have a dog. Crunchy Cowroo, thank you so much for the G rank tier. I really appreciate it. Hopefully you're having a fantastic day. Jonathan, thank you so much for the G rank tier. I hope you're having a fantastic day, my friend. Keep up the good work. Strange Lee, another amazing community member. Thank you so much, Strange Lee. I really do appreciate it. And I hope to see you in the Twitch chat again. I hope to see all of you in the Twitch chat again. Ben VB, thank you so much for the G rank tier. One of my first G rank tiers, honestly. So shout out to Ben VB for that. I do appreciate it. I do appreciate it, Ben. Ludafumi, still trying to get that Zenogre Jasper. Hopefully by the time you're watching this, you got it. But I do appreciate that you threw over the G rank tier to try and get some of my good luck. You know, I try to bestow upon you guys my good luck, and I appreciate that, Ludafumi. Rosa Leo, of course, one of the other major community members in the Discord, and has done some amazing art for the channel, both commissions and just some amazing fan art that I suggest that you guys check them out. Justin, thank you so much for the G rank tier. You're fantastic. I hope you're having a great day. Same to Kepler for the G rank tier. Hope you're having a great day, Kepler. You're balling, you're faded. Mr. Janky, thank you so much, my good friend, for the G rank tier. I appreciate it, and I hope you're having a great one. And thank you to everybody that's been supporting the channel so far, you know, throughout its lifespan. It's been going great. I hope to see some more growth as we continue forward, and I hope you all have an amazing day and an amazing time. I will see you in the next video.